have not met yet. I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us and to be here to remember Jesus and all of the wonderful things that he's done. And now we're going to take some time, and I'd encourage you to turn to 1 John chapter 2. We're going to be there. So the last few weeks and in the weeks to come, we're going to be walking through 1 John and applying it to our lives here. As we start, I want to start thinking about some things, and I want to tell you that I have a control problem. I think so sometimes. It depends on what it is. But I do like to have things a certain way. I like to be comfortable. I like to have answers. And when I don't have answers, I don't like that. And that's something that I have to deal with. I'm sure there's other control freaks and perfectionists in this room, just like me. One of the things that I wonder about sometimes is, how can I know that I actually know God? How can I know that I'm on the right track? And that I'm not just fooling myself and kidding myself with what I'm doing with my life? Have you ever wondered that? How can I know that I actually know God? How can I know that I am living in God and what he wants for me? We're actually going to talk about that today, and the apostle's given us some answers and some tests about those things. As you've seen in 1 John, John gives a lot of tests, and he uses them to help us to see where we stand. He likes to show both sides of the coin. Of if we say this or we do this, these are the consequences. But if we say this or do this, then these are the consequences. And today is going to be a lot like that. But this message that he's given us, he said, we are the eyewitnesses to Jesus. We felt him and we touched him, we heard him, and we ate with him. And the message that we told you that he gave us was God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. And that message that God is light, it has some implications. It makes some demands on our life. We can't just say, oh, God is light, and that's who he is, and great. But God is light has some consequences. And then John identified the different ways that we can approach that, and he identified Jesus as the atoning sacrifice and the advocate for sins that God presented to bring us out of darkness and into God's light. That is Jesus. Jesus is how we can be brought into the light. And so the message that John introduced to us back in chapter 1 was God is light, and that's still the message that he's talking about today. John wants us to remain in the teachings of Jesus, because that's how we remain in the light. That's how we abide in God. And really, what our big idea that I want us to take away today is to be sure that we know God and that we are living in his light. We need to obey him. It's a very natural thing. And specifically, we need to obey him by actively loving each other. That is what we're going to talk about today. To be sure that we know God, that we are on the right track and living in him, we need to follow what he says. And specifically, what he says to us is we need to actively love each other. And so that test, that question that we talked about of, am I in God? Am I walking in the right way? Am I abiding in the light? Let's jump into chapter 2 and what was read for us earlier that John is addressing. So we're going to talk about this as living in the light through love. And what John says in chapter 2 and starting in verse 3, and again, if you're using an ESV, it's going to jump in the middle of a paragraph, but really I do believe this is a new thought here. And he says, and by this we know that we've come to know him, if we keep his commandments. Whoever says, I know him, but does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps his word, in him truly the love of God is perfected. And by this we know that we're in him. Whoever says he abides in him ought to walk in the same way in which he walked. And so let's start with that. That's the first idea that John gives to us. And so what John introduced us to, of course, is the message of the gospel back in chapter 1 and verse 5, that God is light. And the advocate and the atonement for those things to bring us out of that darkness into light is Jesus. And so to know God, you have to know Jesus. And to remain in Jesus, you have to keep his commands. And that's really the logic that is going through this paragraph here in verses 3 through 6. But let's jump into that a little bit. Well, as we talked about in verses 5 through 10 of chapter 1, John's addressing some of the things that these problematic teachers are bringing into the churches of those that he knows. And they're saying things like, I know him, I'm in fellowship with him. They're saying things like, I don't have any sin. There's nothing that I need to be forgiven of. Things like that. We have fellowship with God. We have no sin. And again, here in chapter 2, and I think specifically in verse 4, John is again addressing something that is being said. That these people are saying, I know him, but obedience doesn't really matter. I'm in a relationship with God and I know him, but it doesn't really matter what I do, is what it appears that John is addressing with these people. So John is still showing us how their claims are wrong in the light of this message of God being light. And people would start to ask themselves as they hear this, well, they're saying they know God. They're saying they're in fellowship with God. They're saying that they have come to a true knowledge. What does that mean for me? How can I know that I know God? Because what they're saying doesn't seem to match up. It's not matching what John has told us before. And so people would start to ask themselves, how can I be sure that I've come to know God? And in that language, of course, that's implying that we have met God and that we're continuing in that thing. What we're about to talk about is not how you come to know God, but the result of it. But John is talking to us about knowing God the Father through Jesus. And how can I be sure that I know him? Well, to sum up what we're about to say, I can be sure that I know him when he's guiding my life, when I'm keeping his commands. In fact, Jesus said plainly in John 14:15, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. That's as straightforward as it gets. And so what we'll talk about, what John is saying here, is to abide in God, you have to remain in the teachings of Jesus. This is the test that he's giving us so that we can be sure that we have actually come to know God. So putting that in the context of what he said here in these first couple of chapters that we're looking at, when we've admitted who we are in relation to this God who is light, and then we've accepted the atonement and the advocate that he's provided for us, giving ourselves to him and following his ways, that's how we can be sure that we've come to know him. That seems to be a natural thing, right? If we say that we know God, then we should do what God says. But that's not always how we operate. That's not always how we think. And so why is it that keeping God's commands can demonstrate that I know him? As we're walking through the text, you might have that question of, what's the relationship here of keeping what God says and reflecting that I know him? Well, John shows us here in verse 5 of chapter 2. And so he's talking to us, and he says, whoever keeps his word, in him truly the love of God is perfected. And then this next sentence, it can be pointing backward, it can be pointing forward, but it's still related. By this, we may know that we are in him. And so John says in verse 5 that this relationship of keeping God's commands demonstrates that the love of God has been completed or perfected inside of us. So this could be referring to God's love for us. This could be referring to our love for God, of course. And based on other statements that John makes in this book, and then the words of Jesus that it seems John has in mind, I think what he's saying is it is mostly about our love for God that John is talking about. Our love for God is perfected when we decide to do what he says. And we understand that, and that makes sense. In fact, Jesus actually said this in several different places. Again, the same person, it seems, that wrote what we're reading today, wrote this in John chapter 14 as well, when Jesus said, "If anyone loves me, he will keep my word. And my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him. Whoever does not love me does not keep my words. And the word that you hear is not mine, but the Father's who sent me." So Jesus says, if you love me, you will keep my word. If you don't love me, then you won't keep my word. And my word is actually not something that I've just come up with. It's what God the Father has told me. And so Jesus and his witness John, here in 1 John, are reminding us very clearly, this is not an earth-shattering thing that you've never heard before, but if I really know God, then I will demonstrate that I truly love him when I do what he says. He wants to remind us of this basic concept that we can use to show if we are in God's light or not. Am I doing what God tells me to do? That's the basic test. Because obedience shows this full development from not just admiration or thinking God's cool or powerful, but all the way to a commitment to him because of who he is. God is light, in him is no darkness at all, and so I'm going to follow what he says to me. If that's the right way to look at it, as we said, John likes to show us the right way and the wrong way, both sides of the coin. So if that's the right way to look at it, John says the wrong way, in verse 4, is claiming I know God and not doing what he says. That's the wrong way to go about it. And that's apparently what people were doing, claiming I've come to know God, but this obedience thing, this listening to what he has revealed, that doesn't matter so much. If I say it, but I don't live it, John the apostle, the eyewitness, again, not me, but John, the eyewitness of Jesus, says, if I say it, but I don't live it, that means I'm a liar. That's what John says. Because if we know him, if we truly understand who God is, we'll listen to him. And when we look at these things explicitly, we can see how absurd it would be for us to say, I know God, I have a relationship with Jesus, but I don't do anything that he tells me to do. That doesn't make any sense. And so that's what's behind statements like in Luke 6:46, where Jesus says, why do you call me Lord, but you don't do what I tell you to do? That doesn't make sense. This is important. If I really, truly know who the God of light is, then my response should be to submit to him. Because that's what he deserves. That's the admiration that I can give to him. And if I know the one that he sent and manifested to us, then I'll submit to him. And again, what we've talked about in 1 John is the people that are influencing John's friends seem to be saying, we know God, but the whole Jesus thing is not really that important. Maybe he was a teacher, but we don't need to worry about what he's saying. And do you see the fact that John is laying out in front of us? To know God is to know Jesus. And to know God is to keep his commands. And specifically, he's starting to point us toward the commands of Jesus. They're inseparable. So here's an illustration. Imagine I told you that my wife and I are best friends, which is actually true, by the way. But suppose I told you that my wife and I are best friends. I really know her and she knows me. What would you think if you saw me ignore her when she's talking to me? Or maybe you hear her say something to me and then I don't listen and I go do the opposite. Or maybe I do something toward her and you hear her say, "You know I don't like that," when you do it. What would you start to think about our relationship? Would you think that I actually knew her like I said I did? Would you think that the relationship was as good as I claimed? No. Because if I'm not listening to what she says, if I don't care about what she's telling me, it shows that I don't really love her as much as I say I do. And that's the same thing with our relationship with God. If we claim that we love Him, but we don't listen to what He tells us, then that shows that the relationship is not good. And so John is saying that's how it is when we claim to know God. If we don't listen to Him, how can that relationship be anything good? And at the end of verse 5 and into verse 6, John states this a little bit differently. But again, at the end of verse 5, we said that there's this statement that is a restatement. By this we know that we are in Him. And most of your Bibles will have a colon there to point forward to what he's about to say illustrates this. And some of yours won't. But it really doesn't make a difference. Either we're pointing to the instruction that he's about to give us that Jesus said, or he's pointing us backward to the instruction that Jesus already gave us. But the point is that he's restating his message that he's already told us here. By this we may know that we're in Him. Whoever says he abides in Him ought to walk in the same way which He walked. In the He who is walking being Jesus. So John states what he's been telling us a little differently to help make the point clearer. Whoever says that he abides in God should follow Jesus' example. And what Jesus did was love God above all else and listen to His commands, and even more, we'll get to that in a minute. But abide, that's an important word. So this abide, or you might have remain or reside or something like that, but abide is communicating that we're staying in Him, we're dwelling in Him, we're living in Him. So this is where we're remaining. How we can know that we're in God and that we're abiding, dwelling, staying in Him is loving Him enough to follow His commands and the example of Jesus. Does that surprise any of you? No, but John is showing that we need to be reminded of these things sometimes to help clear and reorient our focus. And Jesus said, again, things very similar to this, which I believe is behind what John is saying. In John 15 and 9 and 10, Jesus says, "As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in His love." That's what we've been saying. If I actually love God, if I love Jesus that He sent, then I'm going to listen to what He says. And that's what Jesus said. Follow my example and abide in the Father's love by keeping His commandments. And John seems to be thinking, I'll say holistically in these verses. So notice he says first there in verse 3 and 4, keep His commandments. And then keep His word. So what he, I think, is communicating here, this is not just following a list of rules. This is living by what He says. And God's word includes a lot more than just rules. It includes promises and hope and encouragement and different truths such as that. So generally, I need to structure my life by what God is telling me to do. So back to our question with that, how can I know that I've come to know God? How can I be sure that I'm abiding in Him? How do I know that my commitment is true? Because how many of us have wondered, am I really a Christian? Maybe I've done some of the things, I've gone through the motions, but how can I know that that's made an actual difference and that I'm truly in God? That's the question that John's giving us the answer to, and he shows us we can be sure that we know God and that our commitment is true when we're abiding in Him. when in our lives we're doing what he says out of love and devotion to him. And so that's something important that we need to know and address. John is saying here, the relationship between true knowledge of God and keeping his commands is not just some kind of blind obedience out of fear. That's not what he's saying here. John says the relationship between knowledge of God and keeping his commands is that it shows that we really truly love him. So my effort toward obedience demonstrates my love and respect. And that is the motivation for keeping God's commands. That's something that we have to keep clear. My love for God and my respect for him is the motivation for keeping his commands. That's what John the Apostle tells us. He's not telling us that we can punch our ticket or earn God's favor by checking a list off of commands that were given. That's completely missing the point. The trap that I've fallen into, because as I said, I'm a control freak, is I think if I just take everything that God said and I just do it all the right way, then I'm going to be fine. Right? If I do it not from a place of love, but instead from a motivation of this is a list that I can check off and I can do, I'll make sure that I'm all right. I've thought that before in my life, that through keeping the commands, I can show how righteous I am, that I can earn God's favor. And that is missing the point. That is the opposite of what John is telling us. He's saying that our trying to live by what God says is supposed to be evidence of our love for him. So what I should be showing in keeping his commands is God is light. And I want to be in that light because I know who he is. And we'll see in a second that John has some particular things in mind about what that entails. And so let's move then to his next chunk of thoughts here in verses 7 and 8, where he says, "Beloved, I am writing you no new commandment, but an old commandment that you had from the beginning. The old commandment is the word that you have heard. At the same time, it is a new commandment that I am writing to you, which is true in him and in you, because the darkness is passing away and the true light is already shining." So let's take that for a minute. He tells us, I'm not saying anything new to you. This is stuff you already know. But I don't know about you, but when I was first studying verses 7 and 8, I'm like, I don't know if I really know what you're saying here, John. But he says, I'm not giving you any extra commands. I'm not laying new things on you. These are something that you've already known from the beginning, something you've already heard, and so it's actually old. This is not new. He's saying, if you look at verse 7, in some other words, my beloved brothers and sisters, I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know. First of which, you need to do what God says. We know that. He's reminded us to keep God's commands and to follow Jesus' example, and this is where I think he starts to go in a specific direction. Notice how before he had said, keep the commands, plural, and now he's referring to one commandment. What I'm telling you can really be summed up in one thing, I think is what John is telling us. In saying a single new command, he's bringing to mind the words of Jesus that John had wrote in his gospel to these people. He seems to be alluding to the teaching of Jesus that shares this same wording of a new commandment that sums up everything else. And a lot of you probably know where that's going. And if we look at this, it is John chapter 13, verses 34 and 35. And Jesus said, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. And by this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. And I saw really wisely pointed out by someone that in this chapter, chapter 13 of John, Jesus has given an example of this. He's washed the disciples' feet, right? He's taken the position of a slave and washed their feet. And he says, I'm giving you a new commandment to love each other in the same way that I've done to you. And if you look at John chapter 2, he's really doing the same thing. In verse 6, he starts with the example of Jesus. He lays out this idea of the new command, and then he's going into what that means and what that implies, and sort of modeling these same things. But this new commandment that Jesus gave, it's old. You guys heard this from the beginning. You know this. This is basic stuff. And really, when Jesus said it, it wasn't new either. The law had already commanded, love your neighbor as yourself. But what Jesus was doing in making this new was he was grounding it in something different. In his example of sacrificial love for other people. Of being the Lord of the universe who stoops down and washes the feet of peasants. That's new. That our love for other people is grounded in the reality of God's love for us. And so he based it on his own personal example. Jesus told us, love each other as I have loved you, and people will know that you belong to me. And so John's given us what really are the greatest two commandments, right? To love God and to love other people. And so what he's telling us here, the commands, the teachings that you need to follow can be summed up in the fact that you need to love God and you need to love each other. And that should come as no surprise. This is what everything is summed up in. We've talked about this before, that what we are told, really in all of the New Testament, really all of the Old Testament too, starts on the foundation of love God and love each other. And everything else just builds the structure from there. So John is taking it back to the basics. He's saying you can know that you're in God, and you can show that what these people are telling you is not true by abiding in what you have been taught. And specifically, he's saying that is to love each other. And what we should see is that, so apparently that wasn't going on. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But he gives the reason for this here in verse 8. At the same time, it is a new commandment. Even though it's old, it is a new commandment because it's true in him and in you. It is being revealed and manifested in your own lives, renewed and revealed. And that is because the darkness is passing away and the true light is already shining. So do this because the light has appeared. It's bringing a new way. It is shining the truth of God into the darkness and revealing things and showing how things are. And that will take us into our next thing, but I want to sort of provide an illustration for what we've talked about. So if you've ever been out in public and you've watched a family, and there's that one family that's got those kids, man, jumping all over stuff, hitting each other and screaming and running and causing a ruckus. And that's not happened to any of us here, I'm sure. But you see families like that, and you can tell a lot about a family if you watch them often and see how they interact with each other, right? If the kids are generally cruel to each other and there's fighting and they're bickering constantly, you start to wonder, what is going on in that house? What are those parents doing? However, if for the most part what you see is loving relationships, and of course there's exceptions to all of that. I mean, are we always perfect with our spouses? No. But if what you see for the most part is love and understanding, you'd tend to think that's a good family. Those parents are doing something right. And so our love for each other is reflecting God's light. It is showing who He is. That's what John is saying. That you show by following these commands that His love is perfected in you, that people see that you belong to Him, that is the light that is coming into this dark world and shining in a new place and showing something that is new, to love each other as God has loved us. And so John says it himself. What he's reminding of us here is not some mind-blowing new information, it's the basics. But basics are important because it's what the rest is laying on top of. He reminds us to observe and follow what God has said in Jesus, and to boil it all down, John reminds us it's to love God and to love each other. The rest of his commands fill in those things. And this must be really important and urgent for those he's writing to, because look at how John expands this in the next verses that we'll end with today in 9 through 11. So he says, then, whoever says he is in the light and hates his brother is still in darkness. Whoever loves his brother abides in the light, and in him there is no cause for stumbling. But whoever hates his brother is in the darkness and walks in the darkness and does not know where he is going because the darkness has blinded his eyes. So we look at this, and you might be thinking, what does loving my brother or sister have to do with light shining in a dark place and passing away? Well, John has told us that Jesus' coming has brought the light, right? And these things that he is commanding us to do are part of that light. And so if we're not doing them, we're not in the light. If we're doing the opposite, then we're in the darkness. And so he tells us loving one another is part of that light that is shining. So whoever says he's in the light and doesn't do what the light demands is in darkness. The true light is shining, but if I don't love my brother or sister, I am still in darkness. And you might have until now, but the point is, up to this point, you are still in darkness if you're hating your brothers and sisters. What does John mean when he says hate? That's a word we hear a lot, right? That's a word that sort of characterizes our society sometimes today. We wouldn't imagine that these people were all treating each other with the same hostility that we would typically think about with the word hate. Despising and arguing and fighting. Maybe they were. But does John mean something different? This word hate, yes, this is a bad word, shepherd. We don't say it at home. This word hate, this bad thing that we're talking about, it can mean holding malicious or intensely negative feelings that we usually think about, but it can also point to indifference toward one another. And I want to show you why I say this. That seems to be primarily how John is using the idea of hate in this book. So let's look, for instance, at John chapter 3, and I'll have this on the screen, verses 15 through 17. So John 3, 15 through 17, he says, everyone who hates his brother is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. But if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? So I want to look at these verses for a minute here. Obviously, hating each other can include the detesting that we usually think of, but the way that John is using it in this book, in 1 John, refers to sometimes specifically just being indifferent or detached or disinterested in each other, not taking the actions of love. And so we'll dig into this more when we get to chapter 3, but in verse 14, John says our love for each other is a sign of this new life, this light that is in us. And then in verses 15 and 17 here, he's contrasting the actions of hate and love. And you see, he starts with hate. He starts with hate, and then he moves to love, and the implication is if you're doing what's in 17, you're not loving, you're hating. So he warns about hating our brother, and then he says, love looks like laying down our lives and desires for each other. But if I see a brother or sister who needs help, and I'm indifferent or cold to them, if I don't help them, how can I say that God's love is in me? So hate is more than actively despising. In 1 John, hate is also being detached or disinterested, not concerned with each other. And so if we were to take what John is saying, of course, despising each other is wrong, but so is indifference. Not actively pursuing love is hate. With that understanding, let's look at the rest of what we're told in these verses. So John says, even if we say we're in the light, that we know God, if we hate each other, we're in darkness. And that doesn't just mean fighting and arguing. That means if I don't care about you in the way that I should, if I'm not going to go out of my way to lay down my life for you, I hate you. And that is not the way that we're supposed to be. John says this very plainly. This darkness that John is talking about, he says, if we hate each other or if we're even indifferent toward one another, we're in darkness. And if you look at this idea of darkness, he's talking to us about the realm of sin and evil. So he says you can say that you know God, you can say you're in the light, but if your actions are not reflecting what the light is about, you're in darkness. Notice he doesn't say, if we say that we love our brothers, we're in the light. He says, if we love as an action, we're in the light. We're not talking about fuzzy feelings and things that we say to each other. We're talking about action. We're talking about lives. So if that's the way that we're operating, John says in verse 10, whoever loves his brother abides in the light, stays, remains, dwells, and in him there is no cause, there's nothing in him to make him stumble. Stumbling, of course, is difficulties, but it can also mean sin. It can mean falling away. However, if I hate my brother or sister, I am in darkness. And if I hold on to that, look, he says that we're walking in darkness. So instead of abiding in the light, if I hold on to hate for other people, indifference toward other people, I'm abiding in darkness. And what's the result of that? I really want us to pay attention here to verses 10 and 11. I gotta say, it blew my mind when I really saw what John was talking about. If I hold on to hate, indifference, those things, because I'm in darkness, I will be blind and not be able to see where I'm going. In other words, what he's telling us here is that hate causes spiritual blindness. Not loving each other as we should, holding on to resentments and anger and all of those kinds of things causes spiritual blindness. If I'm harboring negative feelings about someone else, if I'm nursing a resentment, whatever it is, I won't even be able to see clearly because the darkness has blinded my eyes. And something else becomes clear when we put verses 10 and 11 together. So I want you to look at these. So remember, John said in verse 10 that if we love our brothers and sisters, abiding in the light, then there's not going to be anything in us that makes us stumble. And in verse 11, he gives us the opposite of that. So if we hate each other, we will be blinded by darkness and we will stumble. You see that? He's showing us again the two sides of the coin. If that's the way that we're living, if we're living in indifference toward our brothers and sisters, if we're living in nursing resentments and hating each other, then your life is going to be hard. You won't be able to see where you're going. You will be spiritually blind because you're walking in darkness. That's what John tells us. If that's the way that we're living, it will cause difficulties for us. So sometimes, I've seen in my own life, things are just bad and I have this terrible relationship with this person and they just can't see that they're wrong. But then I'm having all of these fallout consequences where I can't do the right thing and I'm angry all the time. And then I've seen the hardships I'm experiencing are because of my own resentments. It's because of the hate that I'm harboring, the disinterest, the detachment from other people. And I tell you what, addressing those resentments fixes that. Because God is a God of reconciliation, for one thing. But that blew me away, that thinking and behaving this way, John promises us, if we hate each other, if we're indifferent toward one another, and we hold on to that, yeah, your life's going to be hard. Yeah, you won't be able to see where you're going, and you won't even realize that you don't know what you're doing because we're blinded by the darkness. So what is it going to look like if I hate my brothers and sisters? We've talked about that. Holding grudges, resentments, just being like, I don't really care that much about them. If I see them in trouble and they need something, turning the other way. Those are all things that John talks about as showing hate. Of course, it might look more like an active despising them, but it also might look like not caring that much about them. And as I've heard in our classes before, the saying goes, resentment is drinking poison and hoping the other person will die. And you see how John points that out. If we're walking in the darkness and holding on to the darkness and hoping that it's going to affect the other person, we're blind. Because if I'm hating others, I'm keeping myself blind. And so you see this whole thing that he's driving toward, he's been saying, keep God's commands, keep God's word. And the one that he has in mind really is that we have to love each other. That's what we're talking about. Love each other. But as we said, that's action. That's a decision. That's not feelings all of the time, but that is deciding that we're going to love each other. And that is what we're told here. So as we wrap this up and conclude, and we see, how can I know that I have actually come to know God? It should come as no surprise to you that John tells us it's when you follow what God says, when you love him enough to take his directions for your life, that's when you can know. And specifically, if you want the real proof, it's when you can see in your own life that you love God enough to love other people. That's how you can know that what you have done is true and real. That you truly know God when you see those things in your life. And if you don't see those things in your life, if maybe you've called yourself a Christian and that fruit is not there, that you try and do all of these things, and yet the same problems persist, you need to ask yourself, have I really responded the way that God wants me to? Have I really been following him out of love? Or in some backward way, have I just been trying to achieve his favor? I hope that helps to give you some confidence that John shows us we can know if we're truly in God. We can know if we're abiding in the light, and it's a very simple test. Am I taking God's direction? Am I loving other people because of what he has done? And this is an idea that he is going to revisit again and again in this book. And so just as a preview of one of them, John lays out really specifically what we've been talking about today in chapter 3 and verse 23. And he says, and this is the commandments, that we believe in the name of his Son Jesus Christ and love one another just as he commanded us. So we're going to talk about this again. But if you're here today and you've wondered, where is my relationship with God? And you see that the test that John has given, it's not showing the results that you want in your life. And we can help you to do that. We can help you to turn to God, to give yourself to him, to respond to him out of love because of who he is. Whatever you need, whether that is to obey him in what he has told us to do and approaching him, whether that's you need to talk to somebody, just let us know and be thinking about it as we stand and sing.